During the talk, I would like to invite you to use the chat. While the presentation is up, I probably won't be able to see a whole lot of it, but we can use it afterwards, or what I do see during the presentation, we can add the information if you want to make a comment. Since we're talking about mexicanismos, you can add some ideas, add some examples that you have. If you have any questions, ask them in the meantime, so that at the end we can go directly to the chat and be able to pull them out there. Okay, so let's get, I'm going to share. All right. This is a test video to make sure that you can hear and see the.
¿Qué onda? ¿Qué pasa, cuate?
All right. Did everyone hear that and see that okay?
Yes, teacher.
Good. Good, great, thank you. All right. So that was just an example of what we're looking at today. We're looking at increasing viewer enjoyment by using mexicanismos in dubbing, television, and film. And I think you've probably heard and you've seen this happen, but maybe you didn't realize that there was a name for it, or that it was a specific technique that was used in dubbing, because I like to think that many of you have seen movies such as Shrek and Madagascar, and seen The Incredibles and Rango, and television series like The Simpsons and Family Guy. And in those series and in those films, you have seen this happen, even though maybe you weren't aware that this is what's happening. So let's begin with, what are mexicanismos? And we have a number of definitions here: a word or locution from Spanish or indigenous precedents, which is characteristic from Mexican Spanish. This is what distinguishes Mexican Spanish from a larger Latin American Spanish, or even a larger Spanish generically. The RAI defines it as palabra o uso propios del español hablado en México, the same kind of definition, the language that we use very specifically in Mexico. And Dr. Pilar Maínez defines it as la pronunciación, palabra, frase o aceptación usada en el español de México, o de modo característico o exclusivo en comparación con otras variantes de la lengua española. So what we call mexicanismos, quite simply, is words and phrases that we use commonly or in certain ways in Mexico that other variations and other dialects of Spanish do not use. Now, of course, we are generalizing here, talking about all of Mexico, but we do have quite a number of phrases and vocabulary that is generalized, that is used in all of Mexico. And these mexicanismos are what distinguishes Mexican Spanish from other types of Spanish. We have some examples of mexicanismos, tons of them, but just a few. Words like chulo, you know, even que chula es Puebla. The word chulo itself in Puerto Rico is a very derogatory way of expressing a homosexual. And we have the word fresa, fresa as the fruit, or fresa as a very snobby person. Either way, fresa is one of those words that distinguishes Mexican Spanish, because in other Latin American countries, you know that it's called frutilla, and the word fresa as a snob uses other words. So if you would say, I know, ella es una fresa, people from other Latin American countries would say, what are they talking about? We have more common everyday colloquial words such as way, such as chido, that we only use in Mexican Spanish. And interestingly enough, a friend of mine went to Costa Rica and she and her daughters were talking in a store and someone from Costa Rica, nudged their mother and said, hablan como los del Gran Hermano. I don't know if you remember the television series or not. Gran Hermano from Mexico must have made its way into Costa Rica. And so when she heard them talking, she said, hablan como en el Gran Hermano. They had the same words, they used the same expressions, and obviously the same accent. We have words such as squinkle that we use instead of niño, banqueta instead of acera, miscelánea instead of pulpería, alberca instead of piscina or pileta. Some of the ways that we say very common words, if you're talking to your friends and you want to answer sí, do you just say sí? Or do you say something like Simón, Simonquis, Simona la Mona? And if you're like my daughters, it's Simona la Mona Cagona. All right? We use a language in a very unique way. A lot of the expressions and words that we have in our mexicanismos come from indigenous languages. We have enchichar, meaning hacer perder el tiempo. We have metate, petate. We have the word petatear. Petatear meaning to die because they would roll up the dead in a petate. And therefore that became the word to die. These are not used in other countries in Latin America, very specific to Mexico. And this is what we're talking about when we dub film and series. We're talking about words that a Mexican audience will appreciate and find the humor in.
¿Estás listo para un hechizo jacarandoso y sabrosón?
We have the start of our dubbing and subtitling happening in 1929 with the Spanish Latin American Film Bureau. And what they did was propose the introduction of neutrality. A neutrality comes in both accent and in vocabulary. And so this is what makes film and television universal. It makes it understood. One of the things that you've noticed recently in books, for example, you either have a book translated for the Spanish from Spain, or you have a book translated for Latin America. Those are the two variations that we have. And this is the idea of the universality or the neutrality, meaning that versions are made for many different countries, trying to use a very neutral language, a neutral accent, neutral vocabulary, so that it can be understood by everyone. Now, of course, this has to do a lot with money and with costs, meaning that it's very expensive to make a movie, make television, translate a book for every single country in Latin America, right? It would be individual. And so the idea was to bring out this neutral that could be enjoyed, and notice my air quotes, enjoyed by everyone in Latin America. Some of these examples of this neutrality or this universality that we have, you've seen in movies and television, they say, oh, Dios mío, no lo puedo creer. And I'm sure you don't run around saying, oh, Dios mío, right? You have other expressions that you would use. Oh, diantres, válgame, recorcholis. These are examples of what they considered this universal or this neutral Spanish that became a very generic Spanish. And later on, we're going to see that some of the criticism that we have from this is that you try and please everyone, but you really don't please anyone in the end. We see lots of different shows and movies nowadays that have been using mexicanismos in their dubbing.
¿Qué? ¡Órale! Permíteme, papá. A ver, entonces, ¿cómo es posible que yo siga aquí hablando con mi amigo Finn?
And I think one of the ideas, for example, with The Simpsons, with Family Guy, and with many films, has been the introduction of the use of mexicanismos, making it much more specific to your context and not quite so generic or open to a universal Spanish. Dubbing is what we also call AVT, or audiovisual translation. Now, dubbing is different from a voiceover, right? And dubbing basically is where they take out the original voice and they put a new voice in, a new interpretation of the dialogue. However, a voiceover, you sometimes see television shows where you hear the original, but you also hear a dubbing on top of that. That's a voiceover. And so our dubbing has been a long-standing tradition in Mexico and many Latin American countries. People originally did not take the subtitles. They were not interested in hearing it in the original language. They wanted it in a language that they could sit down and understand it without having to read the subtitles that went along with it. And of course, not having to read subtitles is especially good for children, for the elderly, and a large population of Mexico, which is illiterate. Now, even though someone can read and is maybe not illiterate, they still do not read subtitles as fast as they need to in order to understand the meaning. So there is an extremely large population of Mexico that needs dubbing instead of subtitling. And so if you remember shows like Alf or like The Nanny or other shows that were brought in from other countries, they were not subtitled, but rather they were dubbed in order to follow this tradition. However, they were dubbed using this neutral Spanish or this universal Spanish. That same show could have gone to any country that speaks Spanish and it still would have been understood completely.
Perdieron los Knicks.
¿Qué se le va a hacer?
¿Dijo estación Gran Central o mi loción huele a tamal?
Es aquí.
That's one of my favorites because it shows the next point specifically. It shows cultural identity and humor. Each culture has its own identity and it has its own humor, what it considers funny, what it considers interesting, what it considers good humor and good fun. And so we have some definitions here, you can see them, of cultural identity. But the important thing here is one of the elements of this cultural identity is this shared humor and what a culture considers funny. Now, of course, again, we're generalizing, but there are many things that we have as a whole, as a general, that show how we feel about humor. Right now, we can see memes, and we see memes showing what is funny about our culture and what our culture considers funny. And there are a lot of kind of jokes that in other cultures, they may not find the humor because they are specific to Mexico. There's this idea of a lawyer joke. And in English, you can make a lawyer joke and people will laugh. Because in English-speaking countries, specifically the United States, we have this kind of hatred to lawyers. And so lawyer jokes are great fun. Now, in order for that same lawyer joke to be funny in another culture, we would have to assume that that culture also shares this hatred to lawyers. And really, in Mexico, do we hate lawyers? We don't have that idea because lawyers are really not used as much here in Mexico as they are in other countries. And lawyers are not maybe considered um, bad or not considered parasites or not considered something that you would have to hate here in Mexico. Lawyers are just lawyers, period. All right. Now, there may be other areas, politicians, for example, or there may be other areas of people, of jobs, of occupations that you think, and jokes would be great when they come to that. So, in order for something to be funny, it needs to share that humor that a community, that a group of people share. And a lot of that humor comes not only from the subject, but it comes from the way it's said. And I hate to use these examples sometimes because I don't want to offend anyone, but you have a long tradition of Gallego jokes. And so when you're talking about someone who's considered stupid, someone who's considered slow, he is automatically a Gallego. He speaks a certain way. When somebody tells the joke, they speak that certain way. They use that accent, normally called Benantio. All right. And when something bad or something happens because of stupidity or slowness, it usually involves them. Now, do other cultures have a problem with gallegos the same way we do in Mexico? Maybe, maybe not, right? But that's a good equivalent as to something that would be funny in our culture, but not funny in other cultures because we don't share that same idea of what a gallego is. In my culture, an equivalent of the gallego joke would have been a Polak joke. Now, we don't tell those jokes anymore because obviously we've learned that it's not what you should do, but it's a good equivalent. And members of our community would laugh at a Polak joke, the same way members of your community may laugh at a Gallego joke.
Tú, cuadrúpedo, ¿do you speak español?
Yo lo explico.
¿Qué continente es este?
Manhattan.
Témpanos de hielo. Seguimos en Nueva York. Aborten. Abajo, abajo, abajo.
A ver, tú, monja. Momento. ¿Qué están haciendo?
The first thing here, the idea that in the original, right, they're using other languages that would not be understood by Spanish speakers, and it changes in the language here where they would use English for a Spanish speaking audience. And then of course the idea of penguins being referred to as monjas because of the way that they're dressing. You wouldn't find that in many other cultures. And this is something that would be truly comical in Mexican Spanish because those are one of the things that we find humorous. When a joke can't be unlocalized, or better yet, localized, it fails. And by localization, we mean making it very specific to the culture or to the community that is going to hear the joke. And so if you have a joke from a different language, a different culture, and many of you know this because you've tried to tell jokes or explain jokes to someone, you have a joke from a different language, a different culture, and you tell that joke to someone, it fails. Now, sometimes jokes are very universal and people understand them, but other jokes would not be understood because they have not been unlocalized, they have not had those foreign elements taken away, or they have not been localized, meaning that they have not had the specific elements of what makes humor. They have not had those elements put there yet. Many of you probably know the cat Garfield. And Garfield is the Guinness World Record holder for the world's most syndicated comic strip, and meaning that Garfield is present in the entire world. Why is Garfield so popular and so well embraced by different cultures? Because Garfield's humor is generic. Garfield's humor is not based on specific social, cultural, or political jokes, as many are. And so you have an example. There's John, and there's a buzzing coming from John's pocket. John says, "Oh, that's just my phone." And Garfield says, "But wait, isn't that your phone?" And of course, John runs out, and Garfield says, "You're not going to answer the bee? Ha 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 ha." We all understand buzzing phones in our pockets. We understand bees. There's nothing specific to a certain area there. And that's what makes Garfield's humor so well accepted throughout the world. If you've ever seen the television program Saturday Night Live, I watched the show with my husband and I laugh and I laugh and I laugh. And of course, my husband looks at me like I'm a little bit crazy. And when I try to explain why it's so funny, it's all lost because the show, the humor is based completely on pop culture, celebrities, social matters, politicians, things that are happening in the news, and things that someone from outside of the culture would have trouble understanding unless they came in and learned about the culture in order to understand the humor. So the more generic the humor is, okay, but what we're doing here is trying not to make it generic, but rather taking something very specific, changing it, and adapting it and localizing it to something even more specific. So we want that in our pocket here, right? Not talking about Garfield. We need to localize the joke. We need to localize the humor. And by localizing it, we're bringing it to Mexico. We're adding phrases and words, expressions that people in Mexico think are funny when they hear it. And they are, and they are. And they really change the comedy, they change the humor when they're heard.
Entonces cuéntame quién los oculta.
De acuerdo, te lo cuento. ¿Tú conoces a Pimpón?
¿A Pimpón?
Sí, Pimpón.
Sí, es un muñeco muy guapo y de cartón.
Sí, se lava su carita con agua y con jabón.
¿Con agua y con jabón?
Sí, se lava la carita.
Se lava la carita con agua y con jabón.
Milord, lo encontramos.
The very famous, right, changing the Muffin Man into Pimpon. And as we've seen in class, we know that as either adaptation or an equivalence, meaning taking something that we have in the original language, the Muffin Man, which is unknown in the other culture, and we bring it in as something that is now known in that culture. The thing that makes translation so complicated are these cultural specific concepts, or CSCs. And Newmark discusses four different categories of these cultural specific concepts, right? Working with ecology in terms of animals, plants, winds, mountains, landmarks, material culture as in food, clothing, housing, transportation, community, social culture as in work and leisure activities, and organizations, customs, and ideas as in political, social, legal, religious, artistic, historical aspects of a culture. Now, if we all shared the same culture and the same elements of our culture and the same language, and we would have absolutely no trouble translating. It would be this for that. However, the problem is when you have these cultural differences. How do you express those in another language? The idea that some translators put behind this, or the original dubbing of film and television, is this idea of neutralization, right? Making the cultural specific concepts more neutral for the target audience. For example, in Pennsylvania, we have a cold cut that I love and adore and I miss more than anything, and it's called bologna. And if I would mention bologna, I would probably translate that as a carne fria, just a very general, generic kind of, right? We have lots of carne frias. We have, ham, and we have the smoked ham, and we've got tons of different, and bologna is one of them. But all we did, instead of trying to translate bologna or borrow it or somehow describe it or use others, we would just neutralize it and say, una carne fria. Now, if I would say, that's a bunch of baloney, meaning, right, it's a crock of crap, we might say patrañas in Spanish. What we did was neutralize it. We didn't try and bring out the cultural elements, but rather we made it more neutral. There's an example of this in, I think it's Family Guy, where we have Stewie, and someone says to him, Stewie, Suez Canal. We have this play on words, the Suez Canal, like the Suez Canal. But we can't bring that over into Spanish because it doesn't work the same way. So what they did, instead of saying Stewie, Suez Canal, they said Stewie, mi gran amigo Stewie, meaning they neutralized it. They just made it more generic, more general, and didn't try and play on words. You know that in Mexican culture, we love to play with words. We love to give people other names. We love to add little nicknames or diminutives to the end of names. And so the translator could have really worked with this and found something that played with names the same way we do in Mexico instead of neutralizing. And so this is what we see as the problem. When we try and neutralize things, we get this generic language again. How can we find an equivalence, or how can we adapt and make something that is equally comical in the target audience? In The Incredibles, we have all that jazz translated as eso mero. And yet it breathes like Egyptian cotton, translated as fresco, como la guayabera de un político. This translation, in my opinion, is amazing because the whole idea of a guayabera, first of all, is a very Mexican concept. Actually not Mexican. It's Latin American. For example, you'll see it in the islands in Cuba. I believe it has a different name, but it's basically the same type of garment. But what do we know about guayabera? That it's a very cool, very fresh, because it's worn in hot climates. However, who wears it? Politicians. Okay, so we have something there that actually brings more humor to the dubbing than the original. Yet it breathes like Egyptian cotton. That's cute. Fresco como la guayabera de un político. That's funny. And so a lot of times now, when we're working with using these mexicanismos in dubbing, we're actually creating something that is funnier in the dubbing than in the original. And I think that's amazing for our target audience, because traditionally you have been given neutrality, you have been given generic, and now you're given something that is truly yours and that you can enjoy. People repeat the lines from it. They repeat the lines and they laugh a little bit. You watch it and you really laugh because it's now part of your culture. It's now part of your language. making something like this part of your culture and part of your language, that's domestication. And previously, we saw localization. And localization and domestication are basically the same thing, meaning that you're taking something that was foreign and now you're bringing it closer to your culture, to your language, to your sense of humor. If you look at this meme, would this meme be funny in other cultures? Would this meme be funny in other languages? No. Because in how many other cultures, in how many other languages do students on vacation have to paint and clean and do the spring cleaning of the house and fix things around the house? Some of them probably. But this is what we constantly hear from students, right? Working with on vacation, saying, what did you do over vacation? I painted my house, right? I cleaned my house. I fixed something, all right? So based on, right, taking this, if we took this meme and tried to take it to another culture, even in English or in French or in German, it would not be funny because students are not made to paint over vacation. So this idea of domestication, very similar to localization, meaning that it's brought closer to you. It's brought in your language, in your dialect, in your sense of humor, and within your culture.
Creo que dormí chueco.
¡Melman!
¡Melman!
¿Es Melman? ¿Estás bien?
Sí, sí, estoy bien. Ay, a veces me duermo cuando me hacen tomografía.
Melman, no es una tomografía.
¿Resonancia?
No, no es una resonancia. Es un traslado a otro zoológico.
¿Un traslado? Ay, no. No me pueden trasladar. Además, tengo cita con el doctor Goldberg a las
Melman.
5. Y me tienen que
Melman.
surtir varias recetas.
Ya,
Ningún otro
cálmate,
zoológico
Melman,
puede pagar mis gastos
relájate.
médicos. Y no me
Melman.
voy a meter al seguro social.
Sereno, Melman. Vamos a estar bien.
Right? This idea of adaptation, we've seen it already. We've seen it previously when we saw the Muffin Man and Bing Bong. This is the idea of adaptation. We're taking something that's very foreign and we're making it part of the new culture and the new language, the new humor, right? So we substitute what's happening from the source language, the source culture, and we bring it into the target language or the target culture. For example, if we're talking about Friday the 13th in the source culture, it's martes 13 in our target culture. Even though the movies have not been changed to martes 13, and for this reason now, people understand in other cultures what is meant by Friday the 13th. But still culturally, it's not Friday, but rather Tuesday. The early bird catches the worm, el que madruga, Dios le ayuda. We have, for example, in English, if we would call someone a pack horse because they're always carrying their backpack and bags and things. In Mexico, we might call them pipila because of pipila with the stone on his back trying to avoid being shot. In Shrek, at one point, someone says, could you just grin and bear it? And the dubbing of that one says, ¿podrías ponerle al mal tiempo buena cara? Okay. ¿Podrías ponerle al mal tiempo buena cara? Which is an expression that you have in Mexico. And so instead of just saying, podrías sonreír y aguantarlo, they actually found an expression that is more local, right? That is more cultural and that sounds better and gets more laughs when you're looking at the film itself.
Regina George no es dulce, es una golfa barata come porquería que arruinó mi vida.
Es fabulosa, pero es malvada.
Oye, sal de aquí.
Ay, niño de Atocha, de mi dedito, me encanta tu trabajo.
This brings us to the Scopus theory, which we had started looking at in class, in the last class that we had. And scopos basically meaning the purpose of the translation, the aim or the function of the translation. And the aim or the purpose of the translation depends on the knowledge that the readers or the watchers have, expectations, values, norms, meaning knowledge. What do the readers know? Or what do the readers need to know in order to understand this? Expectations, what do they expect? Or what should they expect when watching this, right? What do they value? What is funny to them? What is sacred? What are some things that you don't touch, that you don't make funny, right? And the norms, what are the rules of what is created as humor and what is made funny, right? Interestingly enough, for example, in Mexican culture, the mother is sacred. Mother's Day, big thing. However, the majority of our swear words, and when we're angry at someone, the mother comes up. So it's interestingly how we have that contradiction in the mother being sacred. However, I guess the best way to really get at someone is to talk badly about their mother. Right? So we have certain things that our audience needs to know, our audience expects, our audience already knows. So we might think that they have a certain knowledge that they don't already. Or maybe they expect something when they actually expect something different. But our scopos is our purpose. And this is the example that we were talking about, this sign outside of Cathedral here in Puebla. The purpose of this sign is to tell the person to take off their hat. Do you see here, take off your hat? We don't see it here. And so this is an example of how the purpose is not met. What does the person reading this need to know? They need to know Spanish. They need to know Spanish in order to understand this. But if they know Spanish, then there's no point in having the translation because the English is not helping them at all. So what is the purpose now? What is the purpose of using mexicanismos in film and television? Right? The first purpose is to give them a humorous effect.
Huele a azufre. Nos estamos acercando.
Ay, sí, tú azufre. ¿A quién quieres engañar? Si hubiera sido azufre, mi nariz no sufre. Azufre.
Se caben mis muebles, pero me queda muy lejos.
Shrek, ¿te acuerdas cuando dijiste que los ogros tenían capas?
Oh, sí.
Pues yo tengo algo que confesarte. Los burros no tienen capas, pero ¿has oído decir que el miedo no anda en burro?
Sí, claro. Es un dicho muy famoso.
Exactly. El miedo no anda en burro. That's an expression that was taken specifically for burro here in Shrek. Another example in Madagascar, when someone says, look at the zebra taking care of business. And in Spanish, it's translated as, chequen a la zebra pintar su raya. Right? So the mexicanismos that we use in film and television really just are to give this humorous effect and to make the audience feel that someone is worried about making this as close to their humor, as close to their culture as possible. Oh, the expression here from Rengo. Todo este asunto huele a chivo correteado. Now, this whole thing stinks 3 ways to Sunday. I actually think that the dubbing here is better than the original. It's funnier than the original. And this a lot of times is what happens. I mean, it's supposed to be humorous in the original, But when you use things that are closer to the audience, you have an even better effect when we're talking about humor. Another purpose of using mexicanismos is to make these pertinent cultural references.
Y por el poder que se me ha conferido...
¿Qué estás viendo?
Todo el pueblo está ahí. ¡Están en el altar! ¡Santa cachucha! Ya dijo la frase.
Y yo aquí perdiendo el tiempo.
In another version of Shrek, it says, one of the lines says, make it up as you go along. And it's dubbed as, al son que te toquen baila. A very important expression. And the expressions, the Santa Cachucha, all of these, right, make a lot of references to cultural differences. The one that we saw with Mean Girls earlier also gives us ideas about these cultural references. And of course, the more you use cultural references, politics, social ideas, pop culture, social media, the funnier it makes it. Another purpose of using mexicanismos to show the peculiarities of the language.
¡Claro! Hablaba contigo. Oyes, estuviste enorme. Esos cuates me querían como burro de carga. Pero llegaste así, ¡bam! Patitas para que las quiero. Se fueron de volada. Fue muy chistoso verlos correr.
Genial. ¡Qué gusto!
¡Ah, qué chido!
You'll notice here that the donkey, the way he speaks is a dialect that we have here in Mexico that many people make fun of and feel that it is incorrect. And yes, technically it is incorrect to speak that way. However, it's a dialect and it is spoken by native speakers. And we know that if it's spoken by native speakers, it's not incorrect, right? So we have him saying, llegastes. In another part, somebody says lazy bones, but instead of translating it directly, lazy bones, they translate it as apúrense. And this way of speaking is a peculiarity of the language, and it is thought to be a dialect of a lower class. And when you use this kind of language that you think is funny, or to not to make fun of someone so much, but to bring out this peculiarity, we use these expressions, llegaste, veniste, llegastes, veniste, oye, ya dormiste, because we believe that it is a humorous or a comical effect that we give to the language. As we had said earlier, what we try to do when we use this generic or this neutral or this universal language, what we actually do is we do a huge disfavor to our audience, because our audience really has a different reaction when we give them something that is more suited to what they are used to. We give them something suited to their local customs, to their local language, and therefore we add humor to what is happening in the film or in the TV. The genericness of a Latin American Spanish takes away from the more subtle humor that each culture values. And we have a quote from Morel de Lema, who believes a neutral Spanish makes both the lexis, the vocabulary, and the syntax poorer. So when we speak with mexicanismos, when we speak how we speak, we actually make a much richer language, because we are showing what our culture values. We are showing phrases and expressions that we think are funny, that we think are cute, that we like to do. The idea that you make people's names different as a way of affection, as a term of affection, or as a term of a joke. It's all a very interesting part of language. Now, we have certain challenges in dubbing, and one of the biggest challenges in dubbing is synchronization, trying to synchronize the facial expressions to what they're saying. And if we don't synchronize it well, we end up having, you know, a karate movie where they're all, "Ta-ta-ta, what are you going to do?" And the mouth continues moving while they're not talking anymore. So really synchronization, we might have a great expression that we want to use, but we don't have the space for it because the mouth has stopped moving and our expression continues there. Now, there are special challenges in using mexicanismos, and one of those challenges is not going outside the formality. And what we might have is someone saying, you know, screw you, okay? And if someone says, screw you, and they translate it as, you know, chinga tu madre, I think that's just a little outside of the formality, right? A screw you might, you know, if it were a fuck you and then a chinga tu madre, that would be perfect. But screw you is not quite as strong as fuck you. So we have to be careful when we're doing this and that we don't go outside of the formality, meaning have the mexicanismos at a more of a slang or taboo levels when it's not quite that strong in the original. We get excited when we start using them and we say, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But we do have to be careful to keep them within the formality that we have.
Espero que lleguemos a Duloc muy pronto.
Ah, sí, te encantará, princesa Tarrete Bonito.
And when we use mexicanismos, what we find is that we're really only using them in dubbing, not in subtitling. Because when we use them in subtitling, it just doesn't have the same effect that it does in dubbing. When we read something, we don't get that same humorous effect as when we hear it. And so we've already seen that dubbing does a very important job to a very large population, and they're able to get the humorous effect right away. And in subtitling, that same thing doesn't happen because we don't register. It's like if you're putting the subtitle of a song, you're subtitling a song, you don't have to make it rhyme because reading it, the audience does not register the rhyme. So it doesn't matter if it rhymes or not. But if the person were actually singing it in the movie, then we would need the rhyme. So you see that subtitling and dubbing are very different in these ways. And mexicanismos in subtitling does not work the same. But in dubbing, which has become a very popular activity for this type of film and television, I think really helps our audience to get the humor, to get the language, to have something that they find is more local, is more towards them. And so when you go to a television, when you watch a television show or you go to a movie and you find that it has been dubbed using mexicanismos, you probably find it funnier. You probably find it geared more towards who you are and how you speak and what your culture involves. Right? I would love to know now if anybody has any questions or anything you would like to say. Thank you. I got a heart there. Yay. Any questions? All right. All right, wonderful. Let's take 5 minutes. There's another quick conference at 11 about work opportunities. And so let's take 5 minutes breaks. You're welcome to stay in the room. I'm just going to turn off audio and video. You're welcome to stay in the room. If in the meantime you think of a question or something that you want to add, go ahead and put it in the chat. Thank you, Esme. Says it was clear and interesting. Thank you. Yeah, if you think of anything, go ahead and put it in the chat in the meantime. So let's take 5 minutes and we'll come back at 11.